الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. Assalamu alaikum, my good friends. I'm going to discuss with you the idea of sex, mut'ah, and marriage. Now, as with any other voluntary practice that has great implications or serious ramifications, sex is a regulated practice within the code of the Qur'an. Yes, it is regulated, not marriage, but the practice of sex, of intercourse between males and females, between a man and a woman involved in the practice. There's the man, there's the woman, but very few people realize that there's also the possibility of the child or the offspring or the product of such a union. And so any sex, casual sex or any other form of sex has always the possibility of producing, of a child issuing from that union. And therefore, the practice has to be regulated. Now, yes, in the West, how the practice is regulated is via contraception. So in other words, the young women would go on to contraceptives, and that is how they would prevent any serious ramifications. Men would also practice, perhaps in their own way, some form of preventative measure, and to prevent serious other problems, like, for example, the spreading of a virus through casual interaction. The couples might engage in protective sex like condoms. So that is how the West regulates, or how Western culture regulates the practice of sex. And it is not a legally regulated, but it is more of a socially regulated practice. Or the conditions or the regulations around sex is more socially and culturally instituted rather than legally. And so the practice of illicit, unprotected sex is completely acceptable within the Western paradigm. So what does the Qur'an say? The Qur'an, of course, regulates it legally, the regulations that the Qur'an implements or applies on sex. And the first thing that it regulates is the concept of approval and the concept of consent. So within the Western practice, consent is pretty much a regulation that is between the two individuals, right? So that the male and the female might have to give consent on their own. And the problem with that is that consent could be subject to question. That concept is not really verifiable in front of a court. And as we've seen with court cases in recent years, the woman could turn around and accuse the man of actually raping her. And so the way the Quran regulates this whole issue of consent is that it requires witnessing. And yes, it is a cumbersome thing, but the problem with not bringing in such a cumbersome regulation is bigger than bringing it in. And so witnessing is the requirement of two witnesses for any consent. For any consent for a man and a woman to get involved in a union requires the presence of two witnesses. Now that presence can be physical, or in our times, of course, it can be virtual. So the person could be the union could be witnessed by two friends online, on WhatsApp or on whatever other form. But the consent has to be made public, and more than two persons will have to confirm that such consent was given. And so that is the first regulation, is consent. The second regulation is the idea of the possibility of children, that a child is produced by this union. And again, the way that is protected is through the witnessing. And the regulated position, according to the Quran, is that the man is always going to have to take charge and responsibility financially for any child that emanates from such union. Even if the union was a short-term union, even if it was a union for a week or 2 weeks, there will have to be the requirement of paternity. The responsibilities of paternity will be on the male. Right, that's the second position, is the male responsibility for financial support to the child and to the mother while she is in the process of bearing the child. Right. Now let's look at the third requirement of such a union, and that is a waiting period between one marriage or one union being dissolved and another union being contracted by the woman. So there is a compulsory waiting period. There is a compulsory pause that has to precede any new union. And that pause is there for the purpose of ensuring that there is no paternity, or there is no possibility of the previous union having resulted in a successful conception of a child. And so if there was no conception, which is only really confirmable after 3 periods of the woman, monthly periods, then the second union or a following union could be engaged in, and that is the third way in which the union between males and females, or man and woman, is regulated. All right, let's look at the fourth way. Unlike the romantic notion that Western society has about marriage, the Quran has a much more realistic view on marriage, and it sees marriage as being prone to trouble and problems. And so therefore Islam doesn't, in the Quran, does not regard divorce with such disdain as you might find in the tradition, in the Western tradition. Although Muslims have embraced and adopted the romantic notions of marriage, which is fine. There is absolutely the possibility or the idea of romanticism around marriage. But the Quran does understand that a marriage is often not to be confused with a romantic union. And sometimes marriages are created, or unions are created, for practical reasons, for short-term benefit. And that is the realistic idea that the Quran has. And so the Quran does require certain regulations around the termination of a union. And the termination of the union comes with certain rights from the side of the woman and certain responsibilities on the side of the man. And the rights that the woman has is that she is able to secure some sort of interim transitional arrangement with the man, so that she's not left dangling, as the Quran puts it. So instead of being left dangling financially, the man is supposed to offer a bridging arrangement where she would be able to get off the existing relationship of financial dependency to a position of financial independence. And that is, I think, the fourth or the fifth requirement, is the arrangements when there's a dissolution of the union. And now finally I come to the idea of a temporary union. You see, in light of what I've said, is that not all unions are highly romantic and for life, and it's not always possible at all times. You see, when a man travels to a distant land and for a temporary assignment for a year or two, it's not always possible to marry and expatriate or bring that woman out of her country back to his land. It's not always possible. I mean, she has family, she has her own financial and economic situation there, and so there's a functional or a practical solution within Islam, which is referred to as a temporary union. And the temporary union would be exceptional. Would not be the mainstream. It would be an exceptional case. And that would take place when a regular marriage is not possible, or when there's difficulty around a regular marriage. And for any reason that makes it so almost unrealistic to have a permanent union, a temporary union is possible in that regard. I think there's one more point, and that is the idea of polygyny, of multiple wives, because that's another feature within the Islamic tradition, is that we know that there is at any given time, not all men are financially able and ready to provide and to take responsibility for a marriage union, the regular marriage union. And so I'm not talking about the temporary union, but a permanent union. And so that is why the pool of available men would generally be less than the pool of available women. We also know that men on average live about 5 years less than women. Men generally die younger. Men die at 38, at 25, at 40, and it brings down the average age, right? So what we have is we always have a greater supply of females than we have males. And that is where the justification for multiple marriages come in. So although the genetics or the genes show that men are born, there's a 50% likelihood of males, of a baby being a male and a female, which means the norm would be one male per one female. We know that due to social realities, due to physiological realities, there are always fewer men than women in the world. Not to a great extent, perhaps, it's 52-48, that's the ratio perhaps. So the idea of polygyny, of more men than women, is another very rational, practical solution to this reality on the ground. And so I've given you all the basic principles around marriage, sex, and union. And you make of it what you like. Tell me what you think in the comments. Do you agree? Do you think there's an injustice anywhere in there? What do you think of the idea of mut'a? Let me know. Share your ideas.